Welcome to a free on-demand webinar presented by Michigan Alliance for Families. We partner with experts from across the state to offer live webinars to help answer the questions we encounter most frequently. Our webinars are recorded and saved for future viewing. Handouts for our webinars can be requested through our webpage, michiganallianceforfamilies.org/webinar. Remember to keep up with Michigan Alliance for Families on Facebook and be sure to check out our other videos on our YouTube channel. Follow-up questions to this webinar can be directed to us at info@michiganallianceforfamilies.org. Today's webinar topic is supports and services, including accommodations and modifications. And our speaker is Kelly Orginski. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Emily. Today we're going to be talking about supports and services, including accommodations and modifications. I think this is one of the most important conversations we can have within an IEP team, and there's lots of pieces and components that go with it. So I'm going to do a little review, and then we're going to move right into the meat of it. So as you know, the purpose of an individual education program is based in the law, both the federal law, IDEA, and in Michigan, the rules and regs. And so sometimes questions we ask come back to the law. So I encourage you to look at both these pieces if it is around a law question. We will have citing of the law within some of the stuff we do today because we need to really define what supports and services and all that looks like. So when you're thinking about having an individual education program, it's coming up, or you know in the spring it's coming up, this is the point. It's to meet your child's educational needs. What are their needs? And an IEP is written to ensure success in the least restrictive environment and a free and appropriate education. So how do we ensure success? I think one of the questions we can ask that really help us dig down into how do we look at success is what if your child is not being successful? What does that look like? So their writing is poorly formed, or they're not able to stay in their seat. What is it that, due to their disability, makes them unsuccessful in their learning environment? So what does that look like? Because then we can start collecting data and look at what those needs are. So the needs might be accessing the general education curriculum. Their educational needs might be extracurricular or non-academic activities. So when we're looking at the needs, we're talking about the needs in the educational environment, all components of the educational environment. An individual education program is about access to and participation in the general education curriculum. There is only one curriculum in the state of Michigan. It's a good thing. It helps us know what the scope and sequence of learning is for that student. So if they learn 1 and 2-digit addition, they learn in 1 and 2-digit subtraction. Everything that happens within the content learning, physical education, music, art, computers, library science, they all have curriculums. So it means you can be in 7th grade and read at a 2nd grade level, or be in 9th grade and do math at a 5th grade level. It's about once you learn that skill, what do we learn next? The purpose of the IEP is about accessing that curriculum. The purpose of the IEP can also be around extracurricular and non-academics. So a child can be getting A's and B's or C's and D's and passing the curriculum and able to access the curriculum, but due to their disability, the challenges might come in places that are non-academic, such as before or after school activities. What skills does a child need to be successful in those places? Field trips, school assemblies, and most often when we talk about kids, recess, lunch, and transportation to and from school. We can write IEP goals and objectives to teach students skills how to be successful at recess, lunch, transportation, school assembly. So you can be doing fine accessing the curriculum, but your disability could be in a way that the behavior is making it hard to be there. So this is the process of an IEP. It is a linear process. And so if you've ever been in part of an IEP that seemed to take a long time or gone wrong or emotions were brought into the room, I can tell you to pull this piece of paper out because people have started in the middle or at the end. Between you and I, personally, parents like to start down at the accommodations and modifications, goals and service. We like to talk about these are the things our kids need, and we're usually not wrong. And school teachers like to talk about goals and objectives, what the student's going to learn, what they've learned. I will tell you that you need to start back at the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. We need to know where the student currently is, academic achievement and functional performance in baseline data, in order to write those good goals and objectives, in order to look at what accommodations and supports the student needs. So if it seems to be stalled someplace in an IEP meeting, probably the best thing to go back is review your PLAF statement. So So when you're thinking, well, what does my PLAF statement look like? I think it's important. These are the 5 questions that you want to be looking at your present level of achievement and academic performance. You want to look what that looks like. So what are the child's strengths and weaknesses academically and functional performance-wise? You don't want to see a child has a great smile and loves music. Those are good things to have. We all agree they're a good thing. But what are their strengths and weaknesses academically and in their learning environment, that functional performance? You want to see what helps your child learn. Is it concrete examples? Is it being able to be partnered with a peer? Is it being able to have written and auditory directions? What helps that child learn in data? Not people's thoughts or opinions, but what helps that child learn. Baseline data about what limits or interferes a child's learning. You don't want to see either an academic or educational label here. You want to see in data what limits or interferes with the child's learning. Unable to sit down for more than 2 minutes at a time. Motor planning to get thoughts on paper takes takes twice the of other non-disabled peers. You want to see objective data from current evaluations of your child, and you want to see within probably a year. You don't want to see 3-year-old evaluations. You want to see objective data that says this is the baseline data where this kid has been in September, and now this is where they are in January. So what does that objective data look like? It could be from a number of sources. It doesn't have to be like the big test, the WISC, the Wyatt, the Woodcock-Johnson. It could be data just that the classroom teacher has collected around a writing sample, and the writing has improved, the ability to sit longer in order to receive instruction. Anything can be there, but it needs to be written down in a way, time, date, what does that look like? How your child's disability affects his or her ability to be involved in progress in the general education curriculum. There's that general education piece again. Again, this is not where you want to see the child's educational or medical diagnosis. You want to see what it is exactly about the disability that makes them a hard time affects their involvement in that. So their inability to sit still, their inability to write in legible fashion, their inability to too much sensory information coming in, and how to integrate their sensory information. This is where you want to talk about that. This is what affects their ability to do that. So when you have a well-written PLAF statement in baseline data from objective sources that is about the child's needs, you're going to write the goals and objectives. And the goals and objectives are the present levels of statement identifying the child's needs. The goals and objectives should be written to address those needs. So that's why it's so important to talk about what the child needs to be successful and what is happening when the child isn't successful. Goals and objectives are what that student is going to learn usually within the next year. So April to April, October to October. IEPs are typically written for years. So where is the child, and how are we going to collect data to make sure they're making progress within the general education curriculum, non-academic or extracurricular activities? So let's dive into the meat and potatoes of today. The IDEA's exact words: a statement of special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. So, we always talk about that. So peer-reviewed means other teachers have used it, or other educational institutions have used it. What else is out there? Nationally, what does that look like? And to the extent practical, so there are some kids, because these are individual education programs, that sometimes there aren't peer-reviewed research out there. We just know that it has worked before and we're going to try it again, but you want to collect that in data. So what's working out there? What can we find that other teachers have used, other educators have used, and then how can we make that work for the child? To be provided the child or on behalf of the child, and a statement of the program modifications or supports for school personnel that will be provided to the child. So we want to exactly what is it that this looks like? What are the modifications or the supports that the school personnel will provide? And so when I think of goals, when I think of supports and services, there is the who is going to do this. What does that look like? How are we going to make sure that these supports and services are put in place on behalf of the child? So one is to advance appropriately toward attaining the annual goals. You have a well-written PLAF statement, you have your goals written. The purpose of supports and services, including accommodations and modification, is to attain those annual goals. To be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum in accordance in paragraph of this section, and to participate in extracurricular and other non-academic activities. Here it is again. The purpose of an individual education program is to be involved in and make progress in general education curriculum, extracurricular, and non-academic, and that's through the use of supports and services. And to be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and non-disabled children in activities described. So the other point of supports and services and the variety of the way they look is to be able to participate with children, to be part of that learning environment, both their disabled and non-disabled peers. So there are a variety of supports and services in order to access a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And these, as it's laid out, are really the conversation we're going to have for the rest of this hour is around what are supplementary aids and services, what are accommodations and modifications, what is special education, what are those related services, and what are program modifications or supports for school staff. We're going to take each of these through and talk a little bit about what each of these are, and at the end we're going to really talk about what it may look like and some ideas of where do we start when we start talking about supplementary aids support and services. So the first one is supplementary aids and supports and services. For many students with disabilities, the key to success in the classroom lies in having appropriate accommodations and modifications made to the instruction and other classroom activities. So it's about modifications and accommodations to the instruction, so that's one area that we can modify. It's about accessing the general education curriculum, so what kind of accommodations and modifications to the instruction, and the other part is that classroom, the functional performance, the learning environment. What do we need to make accommodations and modifications for that learning environment? So two very different places that we can use supplementary aids and services. And some kids just need it around instructions, and some kids might just need it around the classroom activities, or some kids might need both, and they often are very different. So a supplementary aid and service, what your child needs to be educated with children without disabilities to the maximum extent possible. And we rarely have this conversation. This is right out of IDEA. That talks about what your child needs to be educated with children without disabilities to the maximum extent. And we frequently don't talk about what that looks like. How do we support that? How do we make sure kids are accessing the curriculum in the general education curriculum, in the general education classroom? So some of these might be adapted equipment, such as a pencil grip or a seating cushion or something they need to help them access the curriculum. It might be a one-on-one aid, and in different places, sometimes it's called a one-on-one aid, additional adult assistance, adult support. It might be an adult helping them figure out what they need to do next or adapting curriculum. It might be assistive technology, such as a computer, special software or communication system. So assistive technology is an important part, and as we know, it's changing as we are sitting at our computers today. New things are coming out all the time. So what part of supplementary aids and services, assistive technology, might be the thing that helps the kid be able to access the curriculum? Training of the staff, the student, or the parent, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. It might be collaboration, consultation among staff, parents, or professionals. I think this is one of the parts that often gets we don't talk enough about this, that we put a good IEP together based on really good baseline data. We talk about what the student needs to learn, and then how do we do that? An example I can give you is for a student, they all agreed that he really needed to be using, he had some speech delays along with pragmatic language. And so everybody agreed that he needed to be using those skills that were being taught by the speech therapist in the classroom. He had 6 classes, he was in junior high. And how do you do that? And so when we really talked about how do we make sure that what he's learning with the speech therapist is being able to use in the classroom, there was a long pause, and everybody kind of looked at each other, how do you do that? And it really was ended up being written that both the speech therapist and the classroom teacher consultant was written in the IEP, they would have an hour every other week, which didn't seem much, but to collaborate, to talk about making sure what was happening in the speech therapy room was able to generalize and be used throughout the day with the student. So really being able to ask the question about how is that going to happen? What does that look like if we have the students being taught that, and it might need to be taught in a small group or one-on-one. But how are we going to make sure those skills are generalized into a classroom, and how do we make sure that it's a seamless system of delivery model? How do we figure that out? How does that look like for non-academic and extracurricular activities? Again, we have the law cited here. Aids and services may be provided to any of the following settings: general education, special education, non-academic and extracurricular activities. And so that really is that non-academic could be around supports and services, accommodations and modifications, around recess, or around passing in the hall. What do they need to be successful on the bus? What does it look like to be able to access the chess club? What does it look like to be able to access the robotics club or the club basketball? What does a kid need to be able to do this, to be successful throughout their day? So when you think about learning expectations and accommodations and modifications, I think that some things could be both a modification and accommodation, depending on who you're talking to and what the student's individual needs are. But for us to have real clear conversations within an IEP, we need to be able to know the difference. So an accommodation allows a student to complete the same assignment or test as other students with a change in the timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, response, or presentation. It doesn't change what the child's supposed to learn. They're just telling it to us in a different way. We want to know if we've gotten all the information in, they can tell us in a different way, show us in a different way. A modification is an adjustment to the assignment or a test that changes the standard of what the test or assignment is supposed to measure. We are changing what the student wants to know. Instead of having 20 spelling words, maybe there's 5 spelling words. Instead of knowing all the parts of a frog, you're going to know 6 parts of the frog. So it does change the difference between accommodation and modification. And some ones are interchangeable, some are not. I think the biggest conversation we need to be having around accommodations and modifications are around modified curriculum. Because frequently if students are on a modified curriculum, nothing wrong with a modified curriculum, but they may not be meeting all the learning standards in order to get a diploma, and that is a whole other conversation. But know that we need to be very clear, particularly around graduation requirements, about accommodation and a modification and what that looks like. So how do modifications and accommodations really affect the child? You will see on the top here it says Nietzsche, Developing Your Child's IEP, page 16. If you go to our website and you would type Developing Your Child's IEP into the search, you will see the document that we base this on. It just gives you another piece of information that explains it a little bit differently. It gives you both the auditory from me, and then the visual within that document. Most oftentimes when we talk about modifications and accommodations, we talk about what does that look like in scheduling. So when we talk about maybe a student has a preferred schedule, that they have resource room in the beginning of the day or the end of the day. It might be around scheduling that a student, particularly in high school, doesn't have a split lunch. It's hard to go to algebra, go to lunch, and come back to algebra. It might be around a student leaves their classroom a few minutes early to avoid the congestion in the hall. It might be around looking at schedules that a student has more academics in the morning than in the afternoon, or the other way around. So how does the day look like in terms of student schedule? Accommodations and modifications can also be around settings. So what does that look like where the instruction is happening? Is it happening in small group? Is it happening in a peer group? What does the setting for it look like? Materials, and we will talk more about accommodations and modifications around materials. Did the materials, one of the best examples I saw around materials was a student that had a learning disability, particularly around math. And so they would put down, 15 math problems. I think it was in 3rd or 4th grade. And he would look at it and said, I can't do it. I just can't do the 15 problems. Well, we ended up putting 3 problems to a page, and he had to get up, turn it in, and then get another 3 problems. When we divided it around 3 problems per page, getting up and turning around, he could do it at about 80% correct. So sometimes it's those materials. Sometimes it's putting a yellow lens over a black and white paper for kids sometimes with some visual issues. It could be around instruction. How is the accommodations and modifications look around instruction? Is it pre-teaching? Is it around being able to give instruction in several different ways? Is it around instruction with a teacher consultant along with the certified teacher? What does that instruction look like in order to access the general education curriculum? And it might be accommodations and modifications around a student response. Again, it might not being able to fill out all the bubble tests or be able to write a paragraph about volcanoes. It might be the student you will ask the question and the student can tell you all the information you're looking around volcanoes. It might be the student is able to have a small note card with them that has some points that they, not the answers, but the points for them to remember. So response is often the way. I think that's the most important part when we look at how do we access the general education curriculum. How are we getting to know what the student knows? And so accommodations and modifications and support and service not only help us access the curriculum and those non-academic and extracurricular, but also lets us know what the student knows. How do they respond? How do we know what we're teaching them, that in the way we're teaching them, they're able to tell us that they've learned. So some other examples of accommodations and modifications, and if there are a ton out there, these are just some of our ones that we see most often. Is in scheduling, it might be giving a break for tests over several days, that one test is too much or the anxiety level is too hard, so you're going to take the test 3 days in a row the last half hour of the day. It could be working in a small group, whether that small group is other people within the history class, or it could be a small group within the resource room that they're learning to do that. It could be around materials, and the materials really is working around, it says working one-on-one with a teacher, but also could be modified materials. The materials might look a little bit different. It could be around instruction, and it could be about reducing reading level, and there's lots of information about what that looks like. You can read the same content, or you could read about Abraham Lincoln, but you're reading it instead of the 7th grade level, you're reading it at 3rd grade level. There's lots of technology out there that does that. And again, that really important piece around how does the student respond? Is it that they use it on a computer? They're highly motivated by a computer. We load the test on the computer and they're able to respond that way. And obviously using sign language or other ways that children communicate. How are we making sure that they are telling us what they know in the best way they can? So when you talk about supplementary aids and services and accommodations and modifications, special education is a supplementary aid and service. So special education might be. Special education means specially designed instruction at no cost to the parent to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, including instruction conducted in the classroom, in the home, in hospitals, institutions, or other settings. That's right from the definition within the law. So special education means especially designed instruction. So that doesn't say that it is a place or a classroom. It's about specially designed instruction. What does this child need through their individual education program? What does their instruction look like? How does it look like in the classroom? So the purpose of special education is around that specially designed instruction, recognizing a child has a disability, they have a well-written class statement based on data, they have goals and objectives about what they're going to learn this next year, and how are we going to make sure they learn it? Special education, it means that specially designed instruction. So the specially designed instruction means adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child under this part, the content, methodology, or delivery. So the content of the instruction, the methodology of how it's delivered, the methodology of how it's taught, or the delivery of the information to address the unique needs of the child that result from the child's disability, or to ensure access to the general education curriculum. So the child can meet the educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that apply to all children. So I think this is a really important piece when you start talking about what does special education, and we all, depending where we're from, have a different definition of what special education looks like. I want you to be, when you're engaging in conversations, to be real clear that you know this is what special education is. It's a specially designed instruction that happens within a classroom to meet the unique needs of the child, whether it's the content or how it's taught or how it's delivered. So it's about accessing that curriculum. So special education is, we tend to throw that around very broadly, and I think in order to have better outcomes for kids with disabilities, we need to be really specific about what special education really is. There's the related services when we talk about supplementary aids and related services, and it is to help children benefit from special education so that that's specially designed instruction so they can access the general education curriculum, maybe with modifications and accommodations. So he or she may also need extra help in one area or another, such as speaking or moving. This additional help is called related services. And so usually when we see related services, it's usually physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, sometimes a behavior consultant or a social worker. So related services to me always is kind of that who do we need around due to the disability, they might have some access to that. So these are also what some of those related services could be. It's not limited to, but these are what some related services could be. Here it is again, assistive technology. I think that's an interesting piece that we don't talk about enough within IEPs. We really need to figure out what that means. Occupational therapy, orientation and mobility, I think that's a really important piece that I've heard some really good success stories around orientation and mobility for particularly students that are blind or have low vision, making sure that there is some kind of related services so the child learns how to be able to navigate the building independently. That would be part of it. It could be around parent training and counseling, and so I think when we really, that is a really hard conversation to have, but when you talk about related services, and we really have a good IEP team working together, you know, maybe we're talking about implementing a positive behavior support plan, and we want to do it both at home and in the school so the child can have better outcomes in their educational environment. It might be helping the parent help us understand what we need to do to make that look. Physical therapy, it could be some school nurse services, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Obviously speech therapy, and then what would transportation look like for some students. So this is not all, but it is some that could be related services. Program modification or support for school staff, and I think this is a really interesting, you have to have an IEP team that is working really well together to have better outcomes for kids with disabilities, and I think this is a really interesting one. An example of one such might be to arrange for key person involved with a child, given to a child to receive training related to the student's needs. And I think this is such a fascinating one that we don't talk about enough. We don't ask the question, what else do you need to know in order for Kelly to access the curriculum, non-academics and extracurriculars? What else might you need to know about Cornelia de Lange syndrome? What else might you need to know? Because when IEP teams come together, there is most likely many people on the team that really don't understand the child's disability and how it affects their ability to progress in the general education curriculum, non-academics, and extracurricular. And so I think this is a really good question to ask. You know, what else do you need to know about Kelly? Because, you know, when we start throwing labels around like ASD or CI or LD, everybody has their own perception of what those labels are rather than really what this student's needs are. And so I think that it is important to ask everybody what else do they need to know, or if things aren't going well, like we talked in the beginning, that the student's needs aren't being met, they aren't successful, maybe it's not around the child, maybe it's that the team needs additional information or training in order to help a child access the general education curriculum, non-academics or extracurriculars. Good conversation to have, but it's people need to be really honest when we're talking about things like that. There are a couple things to think about when you're talking about supports and services and accommodations and modifications. There are two exclusions. One is medical services may be provided by a licensed physician, but only for diagnostics or evaluation purposes. So medical services can be provided, but only for those two purposes. And that medical devices that are surgically implanted may not be provided as a related service. So the schools, the educational institution, the schools do not have a doctor on an IEP, nor do they pay for any surgically implanted devices. So those would be two exclusions when we talk about supports and services. But here's the other part of it. However, the school system remains responsible for monitoring and maintaining medical devices that are needed for the health and safety of the child. This includes breathing, nutrition, and other bodily functions. So within an individual education program, the school system would be responsible for an insulin pump monitoring, a school system would be responsible for how does a trach tube work. One of the longest conversations I had within an IEP was around a student who had seizures and medicine needed to be given to the student within 3 minutes. And how do we put together around that health monitoring and safety of the child, and how do we figure that out? I think the other interesting piece here, it says includes breathing, nutrition, and other bodily functions. I read that to say toileting needs. So the schools do remain responsible for monitoring and maintaining the health devices along with breathing, nutrition, and other bodily functions. And so that's, again, tough conversations, but when you're talking an individual education program, how do they access the general education curriculum? How do they have extracurricular and non-academic achievement? Who do we need to do that? What part of the plan what part of the plan do we need to make sure this is happening for the child so they can access the learning environment? So just those two pieces to be aware of and having conversations about, because with the example I gave about the medicine being needed to be administered for seizures, the conversation was, I'm not doing it and neither is my staff, and then there was a long conversation about, but the law is clear about what it looks like and how do we put that together. And literally when we dug into it, the principal said, he didn't have a problem doing it, but he didn't want to be responsible because wonder if he wasn't there. If he wasn't there, then who would do it? And if they weren't there, then who would do it? And so it was quite a conversation about, so if the principal wasn't there and they knew he was going to do that, who was the second person that would be in charge of that? Because we know that schools don't have nurses on staff all the time. And so there was a real conversation about what that looked like. Was there a need for a nurse there all the time? And the parents didn't feel there was. The child had only had like 4 seizures in the last school year, but it was important to get the medicine in. And so how do we put those pieces together? It worked out all right. The principal was willing to take the responsibility to do it. The parents were fine with that, and then they identified the social worker, and I think a vice principal is kind of that in order. So the principal knew if he wasn't going to be there that day, he made sure that the social worker knew he wasn't going to be there, and that if the student had a seizure, that they were the person to administer the medicine. So it was quite a conversation to get that detailed of a plan out, but indeed it worked itself out. But it was more than just a 45-minute conversation. I think one of the other things to think about that we frequently see written in IEP is the as needed, and there is nothing that makes us all more uncomfortable than as needed when we look at supports and services, accommodations, and modifications. Because nobody really knows what as needed is. As an IEP team, we have this general kind of conversation about what as needed is. It's not something they need all the time. It's just as they need it. But it is, how do you define that? How do you nail that down? So as needed for who? So as needed is it always should be for the student. The student, for who, and then by who. So as needed, to see the social worker, as needed for behavior monitoring. What does that look like, that as needed? As needed should only be written when it is for the student and not convenient for the staff. So we need to be able to define the child's needs, and the reason we're saying this is as needed is for the student, not because the social worker is only there once a week. And it should be well defined in the IEP. And so I can give you a really good example. It's as needed. So a young man that I knew had lots of anxiety, coming to school, being in school, leaving school, just lots of anxiety. And we did evaluations, and we had some really good baseline data. And we wrote it into the IEP that he would come, his parents were willing to bring him to school 20 minutes early, and he would see, it was the school counselor, he would see the school counselor 3 days a week, as needed, but 3 days a week, as decided by the parents and the school staff that might have seen anxiety from the day before. For the first 8 weeks of school, we wrote. And so his parents would, either the teachers would say, I think he needs to come in early, or his parents would say, Andrew, I think you need to be there early, and he would see for the first 6 to 8 weeks, he was seeing the counselor 3 times a week for 20 minutes. And then as we were collecting data and his anxiety went down, we talked about as needed, and he really thought he could decide what as needed looked like. His parents weren't, the IEP team and his parents weren't quite sure what that looked like, so for the next 6 weeks it was as needed, twice a week, defined by Andrew. And so Andrew said, I will be there every Monday and Wednesday. And then as the year went on and we got into the second semester, we defined as needed as identified by Andrew. And there was 2 teachers that he particularly liked and thought they had a good judge of when his anxiety was high, and we put the 2 teachers' names in there. So if Andrew might not be recognizing his anxiety, Mr. Robertson would say, Andrew, I think you need to see the counselor tomorrow, and Andrew would go. So that was a really well written as needed, because it was talking about Andrew's needs. The first 6 to 8 weeks he was much more anxious, and then he was being able to identify his anxiety, and then it was as needed for him and those trusted people to identify his anxiety. So it needs to be very well defined as needed, and instead of this kind of nebulous thing. We'll have accommodations, be able to take tests as in a smaller group as needed. Is that as needed decided by the student, or is that as needed decided by the teacher? So you really need to have those conversations. I would have a huge red flag in any IEP that that as needed is in there without having a long conversation about who and by who and why is as needed really important for that student in order to access the general education curriculum and have better outcomes. So that's a real red flag that people should be having good conversations about. So Kelly, what do accommodations and modifications really look like? How can we really use these? And we're going to spend a few minutes really talking about accommodations and modifications that help students access the general education curriculum and other learning materials and activities. So these are just some examples. There's probably 100 more out there, but gives us a base to really start having conversations within our IEP teams about what does that look like. So one of them could be providing alternate books at a simpler level. So that sounds like a great idea. My son is in 7th grade. He's reading at a 3rd grade level. We want him to be able to read about volcanoes and the Civil War and the structure of a cell. And everybody agrees that's probably a great idea. So where do we get the books? Who gets the books? Who's responsible for the books? Are they online books or are they paper books? Are we printing off sections of a comparable science book? Are we uploading? We used to upload some of the science books and then put them through a program that simplified the language. Who's doing that? How often are they doing that? I think we can talk about it, and this is where things fall apart frequently in IEP, that everybody agrees that we need to have alternate books at a simple level, but nobody really talks about who's doing it. Is it the classroom teacher? Is it the teacher consultant? Is there time within the IEP or in their day to do that? Do they have the materials within the building? Do they need to be looking at other resources to do that? I think technology has made this easier, but we can write in there underneath support and services provided alternate books at a simpler level, but we really need to talk about how does that happen. Shortened spelling tests, the most functional words, great idea again too, a good accommodation modification, but the most functional words for science, the most functional words if it's a 2nd grader, the most functional words that they're also working within their speech and language, the most functional words within a classroom based on the data a student has. So what would that spelling test look like? The most functional words that are accessing the curriculum. So what does that really look like? Again, everybody would go, that is a great idea. Shorten spelling words to the most functional words. Who's doing that? Is it the classroom teacher that makes those decisions? Would it be a case coordinator that makes decisions? Who's doing that? What does that look like? Shortened spelling test, is that instead of 20 words, it's 7 words? What does that really look like? And how are we collecting the data to see if that particular accommodation modification would work? Using alternatives to word puzzles or word finds. Again, some teachers use them, sometimes don't. Some kids love them, sometimes don't. But kids particularly that might have some visual processing issues or have learning disability specific to reading or writing, what other words, what other things could we use to reinforce the learning? Usually word puzzles and word finds are to reinforce the learning, although sometimes they're just a fun thing to do. And so what else could we do to help either reinforce that learning or, an alternative activity to do. When I was a kid, I used to love those word finds. I'm sure there are people who did not within my classroom. So making sure that if it's a kid's needs are based on that and we know this isn't a place of strength, what other activity could a student do? Using both oral and printed directions, and this is another one. Everybody agrees this is a great idea to use both oral and printed directions, but is the teacher, are they basic classroom directions and the teacher is both giving them and they're on the whiteboard? Is the teacher saying them and having them written on the student's desk? Is the teacher giving them and there is a technology used and somebody is scribing the directions so the student can use it? Is it during all of a student's day? Is it for both PE and reading? What is the use of both oral and printed directions, and who's doing that? How are we making sure if we've decided that Kelly can access the curriculum better, has higher rates of achievement when she's given both oral and printed directions, we need to talk about over what areas, with who, how they're going to do it, and what does that look like. A friend of mine's son would go to PE, and PE was a really hard place for him. It didn't smell right. It didn't look like right. To him, it looked like people were just running hither and thither, and he couldn't understand the rules of the game, things like volleyball or dodgeball, because the directions were all given orally, and we assumed everybody brings it in that way, but due to his disability, to him, the teacher was just talking. He did not know he needed to be paying attention to the rules of the game and how it was played. And so we really had a long conversation about what printed directions would look like for, say, to learn volleyball. And so he was given the printed directions of volleyball. The PE teacher actually had them within the curriculum, and so they made him in a way he could use them. That he could read before, like the night before, or sometimes right as he went in. Sometimes the PE teacher would give him the written directions as he said them. As it went on, sometimes he would read them and say to the PE teacher, who he had a good relationship with, I'm just going to watch for a while. So he could read it and then see them playing volleyball and be able to apply what that looks like. So again, who's doing that, how are they doing it, and what situations are they doing it? Use fill-in questions with space for a brief response rather than a short essay. Again, we're wanting to know what the student knows. So instead of being able to write a paragraph about a volcano, that the keywords are taken out and the student has to fill in those keywords. Maybe with a word bank, they're able to put the words in there that make sense, that let us know that when they read through it, they just need to write one word in order to tell us what they know. Again, who's doing this? Is it the teacher consultant? Is it the classroom teacher? How often is it happening? Is it happening in every subject, or is it just an area of need? Permit a student to rework missed problems for a better grade. I think lots of teachers do this anyway, but due to a kid's disability, maybe that is the conversation, that it looks like, I'm not sure you got that, who does it, when do they do it, how does that look like, and we're collecting data on it. When Kelly's allowed to, given her math is what always comes in my mind, but given a math test and I get it back and I'm allowed to redo the 4 that I missed, if given more time and some thought about it and seeing that I missed them, am I able to then figure it out and do them correctly? What we're concerned about, does the child know that skill? And so this might be a good accommodation in order to get the feedback and move on. Give progress reports instead of grades. I think this is a good conversation to have. Different districts work differently, but what we want to know is, does the student know what we're teaching the student in a way the student can learn it to access it? What does that look like? And so maybe it's a progress report instead of a letter grade. Some students get both. Why would you do one or the other would be a conversation you had. To what benefit for the child? What does that look like? Require fewer problems for a passing grade. I think that is a huge conversation to have. The example I gave about the young man who could do the 15 but had to have 3 to a page. Lots of time homework is just given to do homework, and a lot of times it is a repeat of what they learned, and so maybe it's not that they have to do 25 vocabulary words. Maybe it's just you have to do these 5, and if you do these 5 vocabulary words and you can still pass the test with a C or a B, that's great. So sometimes for kids that often have anxiety or specific learning disabilities, looking at what maybe it's a fewer problems, and lots of teachers, this is one that usually a teacher would, classroom teacher would do, but you'd want to have a conversation about what that looks like because you wanted to make sure that it was accessing the curriculum. Modifying classroom policies that may discriminate against a child. This is, again, a tough conversation to have, but one that's important. Two examples I can think of is one around particularly a student that might have mobility issues that is not able to line up within, the music is playing, you need to line up within the time that you're supposed to be there, and so maybe there's a conversation about changing the policy around some kids' mobility and the way to get into class. I think modifying policies that discriminate against a child, usually we see this around behavior, that their behavior is part of their disability. And so it is not something that is, it is their disability. It is a manifestation of their disability. And so sometimes classroom policies might be needed to modify to make it equitable for student and able to access that curriculum, and what might that look like. Some other ways that supports and services and accommodations and modifications might help, and again some examples, these are just a few, but there are many more. Help students demonstrate what they have learned, and to me that's probably one of the most important pieces when you're thinking about writing that individual education program. We want the student to access the curriculum so they can learn. And so how do we know, how can we get a kid to show us what they know? And so this is some examples of what that might look like. Use word-for-word sentence fill-in. So they have a bank of words and they put it in there. Lots of kids can, have the bank of words on one side, the sentence there, and be able to put the correct words in there. We know the kid knows that. If they're putting the words in the correct order of the sentences, they know the content. But again, the conversation is who's doing this? Is it for all subjects? How often is this a successful accommodation for Kelly, that we've used it before and we know that she's getting around 85 to 95% on any given academic topic? Provide a computer for written work. I think we see more of this, but what exactly does that look like? Provide a computer for written work. Is it all written work? Is it more than 3 sentences? Is it they're available at all times? Is it expected to be written work if perhaps they have resource room? What does that look like? What type of written work? Is it around answering questions? Is it around writing essays? What does that look like? Have a student repeat the directions of a task. I think for lots of students, I think maybe for all students, that it would be helpful to repeat those directions. But what does that look like? You wouldn't ask a student in front of all the students to repeat the directions. And so how does that really look like to have a student repeat the directions for a task? If there was additional adult assistance, would they repeat it to the adult that was next to them? Would they be partnered with a peer that they were able to do that? Would the teacher, once they gave the directions, would they come and say to the student, so, can I help you? Did you get all those directions? How would that look like? For some students, being able to repeat the directions might be the accommodation that they would need. Allowed extra time to turn in homework without penalty. I think this is kind of a no-brainer around that. So homework is supposed to reinforce the learning that a student already had, and as a teacher, you would want to make sure, I want to make sure my student knows the information, and so if it would take them 2 days to do the homework instead of 1, there should be no penalty with that. It is a really pretty standard accommodation, even when people within the workforce and in college ask for longer time on homework, or sometimes not the same amount of homework. Mark the correct answers rather than incorrect answers. That, again, we want to know whether a student knows it or not. We don't necessarily want to know whether they have the ability to know what's incorrect. We want to know whether what that is correct. So again, who does that? How often? For what purpose? Academics, specific academics. What does that look like? Permit as much time as needed to finish a test. And again, if we have really good baseline data in that present level of academic achievement and functional performance, we can pretty much, as we collect the data, we can pretty much talk about what time is needed, that they need an additional half hour, that they need 2 class periods, that they're able to say if they don't do it within the class period, they're able to know that they're going to go to the resource room or to the library and finish it. What is it that, when you talk about needed more time, what is it specific to that child to make sure that they have better outcomes? Allow the student to use a calculator without penalty. Again, with technology, I think we're talking more and more using technology that way. So the purpose is we want the student to be able to know how to do 1 and 2 addition and subtraction. If they can use a calculator to get the same answer, and say they have a specific learning disability in math, that should be okay, that they know the functions in order to do it. They know the sequence in order to get the answer. That might be what this person is going to need their whole life. So to be able to talk about what does that look like, is the math time around using a calculator fluently in order to solve math problems, and what does that look like, where does it happen, how often, all those questions you need to talk about. Provide study guides and study questions that directly relate to the tests. Many students need to have that specifically. They're often not be able to discern about what is it they're supposed to be studying and what they're not, and I do think for many educators they do this, that you want to study what's going to be on the test, and so that could be a conversation. It could be also that you talk about this as an accommodation around students that have anxiety or maybe specific learning disabilities, so they're studying in the most efficient manner in order to have better access to the curriculum and better outcomes. And arrange a check-in to organize the day. I've seen this one used very well, particularly in junior high when kids are learning lots of new things. Is there a check-in? The example I gave about the young man who checked in very specifically. We've around scheduling that perhaps the last 10 minutes of the day I've seen students check in with just the secretary at school and go over their planner about what they needed. I've seen kids check in the beginning of the day with a resource room teacher or a social worker or the school counselor to help organize their day. And organizing their day, what does that look like? They're reading what they wrote in their planner. They're not a planner user, so they're going through their folder of what the homework is. What is it around the child's needs that they need to have that check-in of the day? So again, who's doing it, where they're doing it, what data do we have that says that checking in is a really good way to organize their day. So these are just some ways that when we talk about accommodations and modifications and the supports and services, how it might help a child better access the general education curriculum, extracurriculars, and non-academics. There are many, many more out there. I just wanted to give you a thought about what that looks like. I think as parents, and those educators, that we know a kid and we often don't write down what works, and I think it's an opportunity for parents to really talk about what works at home, and then are we able to do something of the same way to make it work at school in terms of accessing the curriculum to have better outcomes. So these are some resources that we have. There's our 800 number to get a hold of your regional parent mentor through the magic of geo-routing. If you call the 800 number, you will get the parent mentor closest to you. Always our website, and as Emily talked about, we have lots of webinars and other information.
Thank you, Kelly. Michigan Alliance for Families is an IDEA grant-funded initiative of the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education, and we're Michigan's Federal Parent Training and Information Center, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. Follow-up questions to this webinar can be directed to us at info@michiganallianceforfamilies.org.